These are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. Believing. Our gospel this morning starts with the disciples locked up in fear, something about which we know a lot more this time than we would normally during an Easter time, locking up in fear. And Jesus appeared to them and said, "Peace be with you." And the first thing that he did after he said that was to show his disciples his hands and his side, to show them his wounds, to show them the signs of the trauma that he had undergone. And then they rejoiced. They didn't rejoice when he first appeared. They didn't rejoice when he said, "Peace be with you." They rejoiced after they saw the signs. And then Jesus again says, "Peace be with you." Thomas, of course, wasn't there. We all know the story of Thomas, the doubting Thomas, who says, "Until I see his hands and side and I touch and I put my hands in his side, I will not believe." But remember, this was also true of all the other disciples who were there. We just heard that. Thomas was not unusual. And then a week later, they are still in that room with the door closed. They are still there. We don't hear that they're in fear, but I think it's probably not an unreasonable assumption that that's why they're still there in that room with the door closed. And Jesus has revealed himself to them, but the disciples are still there. And this time, Thomas is with them. And the first thing that Jesus said was, "Here, put your fingers in my hands. Put your hand in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." And when Thomas then says, "My Lord and my God," Jesus says, "You believe because you saw. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe." We don't know how much longer the disciples kept hiding, but we are very grateful that we do have a Pentecost where, so inspired by the Spirit, they are able to leave their locked rooms and do something about their faith, about their belief in Jesus, that Jesus was the Messiah, that Jesus was the Son of God, and that through him they could have life in his name. And what might that look like? We heard from Acts today one possibility, and that is that there would be no private ownership among the disciples. But what we don't hear today is what followed that, which I think really shows the full breadth of the human condition. Because we immediately after we heard the Acts section that we heard this morning, there's a story of Barnabas, whose name we are told means son of encouragement. And Barnabas sold everything that he had and gave it to the community. And then immediately after that, we hear about Ananias and Sapphira. And they also sold a piece of land that they own. And they gave some of it to the disciples, but they held back some of it. And first Ananias and then Sapphira, when confronted by Peter about this, lied that they had held something back. And then they were both struck dead, each in sequence. So we kind of see, following that kind of rosy picture in Acts about everyone giving what they had and sharing with the whole community, which I think was very much in line with what Jesus asks us to do, but how that can be very difficult for people. For some people, sharing is something they can do. You know, Barnabas indeed was an encouraging person in this regard, but for others, it was not. It was not. In the first letter of John that we heard this morning, we hear about him, the writer talking about that he had personally witnessed things and that he's describing them to people so that they may believe. One of the things that I really liked from a book I read about 10 years ago, McCulloch's Christianity, the First 3,000 Years, was that he said that he believes that Christianity is still alive now because people continue to have experiences of Christ. They continue to have experiences. It's not about hearing or reading these words that we heard today and that being enough. People continue to have experiences. And to me, that really speaks to the way that God finds each of us where we are. Some people have visions. They see things. They have dreams. They are so touched by something that they observe in the world, whether it is nature or man-made, that they may have a moment of clarity about the Messiah. Others may hear things. They may hear voices which are not of this world. They may hear voices which are of this world that speak to them in important ways. They may hear voices in nature that speak to them. And for others, it may be what they feel, the way they feel when they take communion, the way they feel when they are in a moving service, the way they feel when they are on a magnificent overlook. And those feelings can be also of being loved. Those feelings can be of being challenged. My own great moment of clarity about my faith came after I had come back to the church, and I was in a church service when people were encouraged to each have those who are called to make a little sermon rather than having a preacher. Anyone who was called was asked to preach. And this was in a group where there were lots of priests and a couple of deacons. I was a layperson at the time. People who had been very active in their churches, and at that time in my life, I was a horrible public speaker. Horrible. I had to give a couple of presentations in law school and in conferences afterward. And my ex-husband at one point said, "Please do not ever sign up to do this again because it is just not worth it." Having to deal with, you're talking about how horrible the whole thing was. Please do not ever do this again. So public speaking was not something that I thought, oh, this person, when they said that, is talking to me. But I then had a feeling, and it still gives me chills to think about it. And the feeling was that I should speak in God's name. That was the feeling that I had. And that moment for me was transformative. So it was something real that crystallized my faith. It was not by reading something. So I think we do Thomas a disservice by acting as though we are all not doubting Thomases. We all need to be convinced in some way. The disciples in this story themselves had to be convinced by touching, by seeing. So the fact that we need that is, I think, part of what being human is. And the loveliness of this is that God takes each of us where we are and finds a way to touch us, finds a way to help us see, finds a way to help us hear, finds a way to help us feel that and experience that faith. That is the grace that we are given through our God. I think this past year has, in its bizarreness in our life, in its setting us apart from others, in its turning everything upside down, really given us time for reflection, time for openness to possibilities. I was reading in the New York Times this morning, and they have a series called Resilience in Troubled Times. And one of the stories that I read was about this guy, and he and a partner were about to open a restaurant. And when, like, the day that everything was closed down, it was in mid-March last year. And of course, their opening was put off. And so he had this space, and he was scared to leave. He lived in New York, scared to leave his apartment, and scared to go shopping, and he needed food. And so he set up a way. He started reaching out to his neighbors, something that he had never done, to his immediate neighbors in his neighborhood, in his building. And he's set up a program to kind of pull together and have people buy food collectively. Because when he went to one place, he said, well, if you buy this, you have to buy so much, that there was much more than he could use. And so he that's what he did, and set this up. And he really was talking about what a blessing it was, because he not only was able to help his neighbors, but he was able to experience community in his neighborhood that he had never experienced before. Resilience in troubled times. Through believing, may we come to have life in his name. Amen.